The wind clawed at her coat as the train slowed near a nameless outpost in the middle of nothing. There was no station, just a leaning signpost and a rickety wooden bench lost in the dust. She stepped down without looking back, one hand tight on the small carpet bag, the other buried deep in her pocket where the letter had folded itself nearly in half from worry and sweat. The train hissed and groaned and rolled on, its steel heart unbothered by her choice. She walked, not because she knew where to go, but because standing still felt more dangerous. The dry earth cracked beneath her steps. Above, the sky offered no shade, only a pale dome of silence. Her boots were too fine for dust, her dress too thin for wind. She looked like she belonged to a parlor, not a prairie, but she kept walking anyway. The letter had come from a man named Elijah Rourke, a widower, a farmer. His handwriting was square and careful. "You won't be asked to do more than you can," it had said. "Just bring yourself. I'll do the rest." She had read those lines 100 times before climbing onto the train. They had sounded like a kind of kindness, like something close to rest. But rest never came easy to women who had been passed between hands like coin. A hawk passed overhead. Her eyes tracked it. It made no sound. Somewhere in the haze ahead, a fence came into view. Then a gate, barely hanging on its hinge. Behind it, a house squatted low to the ground. The porch slumped in the middle like tired shoulders. There was a barn too, leaning hard to one side, and a well with its crank broken off. No smoke, no sound, no sign of the man. She opened the gate. It squealed like something in pain. She didn't flinch. Up the steps, across the warped porch boards, to the door. Her hand hovered near the latch. Then it opened before she touched it. He stood there, taller than she expected, hair gone gray at the temples, face lined but not cruel. He looked at her the way one looks at distant weather, not afraid, not eager, just waiting. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He didn't ask for them. He stepped aside. She entered. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood and long silence. The walls bore no photos, no clocks, no names, just dust and space, and the soft tick of old heat rising through the boards. He pointed to a chair near the stove. She sat. He brought water, set it beside her, nodded once, then left. Not a word spoken. She drank slowly. Let the quiet settle into her bones. Let her heart slow. Outside, wind tugged at the corners of the house like it wanted to carry it all away. But inside, she stayed. She did not know if this was Elijah Rourke. He had not given his name, nor asked hers. But the door had opened, and that was more than most had ever done. She took slow breaths and listened to the way the walls moved, creaking under memory, not pressure. There was no ring on his hand, no photograph on the mantel, only the ghost of past routine, still living in the grooves of the floor. She touched the cup he gave her, still warm. In that moment, she did not need questions answered. She needed only this, a place that did not ask what she had been before. Outside, a shutter banged once in the wind. He returned carrying a folded blanket. He laid it gently over the arm of the second chair, then stepped back toward the hall. No words, just action. She understood that better than language. Later, as the night sank deep into the walls, she curled in that chair, wrapped in wool, and listened to the wind press and sigh. And for the first time in months, no one reached for her in the dark. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, to stay. She did not dream. She simply remained. The sun rose without ceremony, casting thin gold across the broken slats of the barn and the wide, quiet yard. She woke before the rooster, startled by a dream she could not remember. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders. Her back ached. The chair creaked as she stood. The house remained still. No footsteps, no stove fire, no breakfast smells. She folded the blanket carefully, as if it were borrowed, and set it down where he had left it. The tin cup still sat on the table. Empty now. She held it for a moment, then set it back with both hands. Quietly, gently. Outside, the yard held its breath. She stepped onto the porch, unsure if it was allowed, and yet knowing there was no one left to grant or deny permission. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stood for a moment in the open air. No sign of him. Only the soft rustle of wind through dry weeds and the faint sound of a chicken somewhere beyond the barn. She walked toward the fence. The ground crunched under her boots. She followed a path worn more by animals than people, down a slight slope to the back edge of the land. There, an old line of wire fencing had given up long ago. Beyond it, open prairie stretched to where the earth met sky. He was there, sitting on an overturned bucket, elbows on knees, hat low against the sun. A rifle leaned beside him, untouched. She slowed, not sure whether to turn back, but he did not move, and so she came closer. He looked up once, nodded, said nothing. She didn't expect more. They stood like that, near but not close, for what felt like a long time. Then he rose, took the rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and walked past her toward the house. She watched him go, unsure if she had done something wrong or something right. Back at the porch, he left the door open. She stepped inside. A basin of water waited on the table. Next to it, a piece of clean cloth and a small round cake of soap. She paused. Then she washed. Hands, face, arms up to the elbows. The water stung, cold and sharp, but it took something from her. Not dirt exactly, but something heavier. She looked for a towel and found one folded on a chair. That afternoon, she found herself sweeping the floor. The broom was splintered, the bristles uneven, but the motion helped. She found rhythm in it, a kind of peace. Each stroke brushed away more than dust. When he returned, he saw the swept floor, said nothing. But that night, when he set out 2 plates instead of 1, she understood. She was not a guest. She was becoming part of the silence. The next morning, she boiled water on the stove, found coffee grounds in a jar near the window. The tin kettle leaked slightly, but held enough to fill 2 cups. She poured one and set it at his place on the table. He arrived from outside with dust on his sleeves and a slight limp in his right knee. He saw the cup, sat down, took it in both hands. Still no words. She sat too. They drank in quiet. Later, she hung a torn towel out to dry on a broken clothesline. A breeze tugged at it, and it snapped like a flag over old land. The wind here had a voice, not angry, not soft, just constant. It reminded her of places she'd once passed through, towns where nothing stayed. But this place stayed. It stood, even when it leaned, even when it cracked, just like him, just like her. The third day, she found a small wooden comb in the drawer by the stove. She used it to pull her hair back, braided tight, practical. When she stepped outside, he looked once, then nodded toward the barn. She followed. He handed her a pail, pointed to the coop. And just like that, a rhythm began. Not of marriage, not of partnership, but of 2 people surviving side by side, without asking, without offering names, without breaking the quiet. It was more than she had hoped for, and less than she feared. By the end of the first week, she had stopped counting the days. Mornings began with steam from the kettle, the soft clink of tin against wood, the scratch of boots on porch planks. He always rose before her, but not by much. She learned the rhythm of his steps, the way the screen door sighed behind him, the way he paused at the edge of the yard before deciding what part of the farm to tend first. She didn't follow him. She had her own tasks now. The chicken coop needed repairs. The fence was falling in 2 places. The garden had long gone to weeds, but a few onions survived beneath the mess. She cleared space and found rows in the dirt with her hands, dug her fingers into the earth and remembered her mother's garden. Not the flowers, but the feeling of something willing to grow if you gave it enough quiet. She didn't ask if she could. He didn't tell her to stop. Sometimes he returned at midday and brought her water. Sometimes he didn't. It didn't matter. She was used to thirst. But not this kind. Not the thirst for place, for shape, for usefulness. She drank slowly when he did bring it, met his eyes once. Neither spoke. That was the way of it. In the evenings, she swept, cooked what they had. He carved wood near the window. Little things. Not toys, not tools. Shapes without names. His hands moved like they knew the wood story already. She didn't ask what he made. He didn't offer. One night she stood in the doorway of the barn. He was inside, sorting rope, checking the tack. She watched him for a while. The sky behind her darkened. A breeze moved through the empty stalls. He looked up. She didn't step forward, didn't retreat. He nodded once, and she nodded back. It was the longest conversation they'd had. She dreamed of trains sometimes, of smoke curling behind her, of voices calling names she no longer wore. But she always woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of chickens, and that was enough to bring her fully back. One morning she found a bundle of fabric on the porch rail, a dress, not new but whole, stitched by hand. She ran her fingers along the seams. It was her size. He never mentioned it, but that night, when she wore it, he looked up from his plate, met her eyes, then nodded again. She smiled, just a little, and something inside her shifted, like a door quietly unlatching. The days warmed. She let her sleeves roll higher, let the sun touch her skin without apology. Her hair came undone more often. She didn't always fix it. He never commented. She found an old bench behind the barn, half buried in weeds, dragged it forward, cleaned it, set it beneath the crooked tree near the well. In the afternoons, when work paused and the world breathed slower, she sat there and watched the land. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way stories described, but it was honest, worn, and still holding. Sometimes he joined her, not beside her, never too near, but close enough that she could hear his boots settle into the dirt. Once he brought a book, read it to himself in low tones. She didn't ask what it was, just closed her eyes and let the sound of it fill the spaces she used to leave empty. That evening she made stew, added wild onions and dried beans she found in a jar. He ate without comment, but reached for seconds. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a cloth and set it down carefully, as if it mattered. She watched him as he stood, and before he left the table, he said something low, almost inaudible. "Thank you." It was the first word he had spoken since she arrived. She didn't answer aloud. Just let her fingers brush the rim of her bowl, her breath catch quietly, her eyes rest on the place where he had sat. Some things didn't need. The heat settled heavy over the land, pressing down on the boards of the house and the shoulders of those who stayed. The breeze no longer cooled. It stirred only dust and memory. She tied her hair in a knot at the base of her neck and rolled up her sleeves before stepping out to the yard. He was already there, repairing the north fence. She didn't speak. She brought him water. He took it with a nod, drank, handed it back. She wiped the rim clean with her apron and stood for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't move, didn't ask her to. Each day stretched longer, but not empty. Chores became ritual. She fed the chickens, checked the garden, folded linens with care. He dug post holes, sawed boards, replaced hinges. They passed each other like shadows do in quiet rooms, never colliding, always aware. One afternoon, as clouds stacked on the edge of the horizon, she found him on the porch holding something wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it slowly, a photograph, faded and cracked. The image nearly lost to time. A woman, a child. He didn't offer names. She didn't ask. He left the picture on the table and walked back outside. She stared at it for a long time. Not with jealousy, with reverence. That evening she placed the photo back in its cloth and slid it into a drawer beside the stove. She did it gently, as if the memory might crumble if held too tight. When the storm came, it arrived without warning. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked the silence wide. Rain pelted the roof like stones. The chickens cried out. The wind ripped through loose boards. He was out in it. She lit a lantern and stood in the doorway. Waited. He returned soaked, boots full of mud, breath heavy. She stepped aside. He passed her without a word, but she followed, grabbed a towel, pressed it into his hands. He dried his face, then dropped the towel on the floor and sat at the edge of the bed, head low. She knelt to remove his boots. He didn't stop her. The room filled with the sound of rain and nothing else. She fetched dry clothes. He changed without asking for space. When he sat again, she brought a blanket and placed it over his shoulders. Still no words. None needed. They shared the silence as if it had been spoken aloud. That night, she didn't return to the chair near the stove. She sat on the edge of the bed across from him, folded her hands in her lap, waited. He didn't move, didn't look at her, just stared into the grain of the floorboards like they might answer something. She lay down slowly, not beside him, not yet, but near enough that she could hear his breath over the storm. Her body curled toward the wall. She closed her eyes. When she woke, the storm had passed. Light filtered in soft and gray. The chickens were quiet. The air smelled like wet earth and ash. She sat up and turned to find him still seated, still wrapped in the blanket, asleep in the chair. His face looked softer somehow, no less weathered, but not so guarded. She rose, gathered what she needed for breakfast, and left him resting. She didn't touch the photo in the drawer, didn't open it again. But later she left a folded napkin on top of the cloth, a simple thing embroidered with a red thread along the edge. She didn't know why, only that she wanted it to be seen. That afternoon the sun broke through. The wind smelled of green. They worked side by side, mending the coop. A hen escaped and ran wild around the yard, feathers puffed. She laughed before she could stop herself. Quick, breathless. He looked at her. Something in his eyes shifted. He said nothing, but his mouth turned at the edge. Almost a smile. That evening, when the table was set, he poured her coffee before she reached for the pot. It was the first time he moved ahead of her, and something in the motion felt like a question, a gentle one, not asking for answers, just hoping for a reason to keep asking. Chores. Some silences meant more than speech, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, and not for what she had been, but for who she was. Now, here, in this forgotten place, becoming someone again, not for anyone else, for herself. By midsummer, the land had softened. The rains came more often, but only in passing. Enough to keep the garden green, enough to make the sky feel taller. Her hands were darker now, lined with dirt and sun. Her back no longer ached from bending. It welcomed the rhythm. She planted beans beside the onions, carrots near the wall. The rows grew straight, not perfect, but steady. He built a fence around the patch without being asked, hammered posts in silence, tied the wire with strong hands. When she saw it, she didn't thank him aloud. Just placed 2 biscuits in his coat pocket the next morning while he sat tying rope on the porch. They ate dinner outside some nights now, on the step, on the grass. The air cooled fast after sunset, and she would bring out a shawl. He always sat a little apart, his eyes never far from the tree line, as if watching for something he never named. Once she asked, "Is someone still coming?" It was the first time she had broken their rule. He looked at her, said only, "Not anymore," then stood and walked to the barn. She didn't press. Regret didn't need to be spoken to be felt. That night she found a candle on the windowsill near her cot. New, still wrapped in wax paper. She lit it before sleeping. Let it burn low. Let it keep the dark soft. Not bright, just less alone. The next morning a letter arrived. A rider passed through, left it at the gate. It had no return name, just hers, the one she hadn't heard in months. She read it alone under the tree. Her hands trembled halfway through. A brother she hadn't seen in years, writing to say their mother was gone, writing to ask where she had gone, writing to tell her he had finally left the man who hurt them all. Too late to save anyone, he said, but maybe not too late to start again. She folded the letter and sat still for a long time. He found her there hours later, didn't ask what the paper said, just looked at her face, and somehow knew. He sat beside her for the first time, close enough to touch, but didn't. That evening she didn't cook. He didn't ask why. Instead he brought bread from the pantry, cut it in half and set it on a plate between them. They ate on the porch again, the candle from her room now flickering in a jar between them. The stars blinked above, quiet and far. She didn't speak, but her hand moved near his on the wood. Not touching, just near. A few nights later she asked if she could move her cot. He didn't answer with words. He simply took her blanket from the other room and placed it at the foot of his bed. That was all. She moved it quietly, with care, as if crossing a line neither of them had drawn, but both had waited to step over. And still, nothing changed in how they worked. The days moved on. The garden grew. The hens clucked. The land breathed. But now in the quiet of night, her breath joined his, not tangled, just nearby. She did not love him the way stories tell it. There were no grand gestures, no confessions, just the slow unspooling of fear, the steady hands that never reached too fast. He never kissed her. But once, after a long day mending the barn roof, he let his shoulder rest against hers while they sat beneath the tree. It stayed there until the sun dipped behind the ridge. She didn't move away, didn't need to. The letter stayed folded in her apron pocket. Sometimes she touched it. Sometimes she forgot it was there. The past was still real, still hers, but it no longer ruled her. This place had changed her. He had changed her, not by claiming her, but by never asking her to be anything other than what she was. And in that quiet, she began to understand something rare. That sometimes love isn't a fire. Sometimes it's a house that simply leaves the door open and waits. The days slowed as summer tipped into late August. The garden gave more than they needed now. Beans in crooked rows, onions sweet and soft, tomatoes ripened in the sun. She gathered them in a woven basket, brought them inside with dirt still clinging to the stems. He built shelves for jars. She boiled water, peeled skins, packed glass with careful hands. They didn't speak while they worked, but each motion answered the other. He moved aside before she needed room. She wiped the rim before he reached for the lid. Evenings lengthened. The light stretched thin through the windows, gold and dusted. She caught him watching her once, when she brushed flour from her skirt and laughed quietly at the cat tumbling over itself by the hearth. He didn't look away, just watched, as if seeing her wasn't something he needed to hide anymore. She let him. One morning a wagon passed on the far road. They both stood on the porch and watched it disappear in a cloud of grit. Neither waved. The house had no visitors. It had no past. It barely had a name. But it had them. And they had become something in it. Not a couple, not yet, but something. She began humming as she worked. Soft melodies. Nothing from memory. Just sounds shaped by the feeling of being somewhere she no longer wanted to leave. He noticed. One day he left a box on the table. Inside fabric. Pale blue cotton. Enough for a dress. No note. No thread. Just the gift. She held it to her chest and closed her eyes. That night she sat beside him with the fabric in her lap. No words were exchanged, but her hand rested on his arm for a long time, and he let it stay. They did not speak of winter, did not speak of what came next. The days were too gentle, too full. Speaking it might break the spell. She mended shirts. He repaired the roof. She learned the names of birds by sound. He taught her how to read the sky for weather. They touched more now, lightly, a hand on the back, a brush of fingers while passing tools. Still no kiss, still no claim. But intimacy had arrived anyway, quiet, whole, without demand. It lived in the space between their footsteps, in the breath shared before dawn, in the single pillow they now used even though there were two. She often woke first, watched his chest rise and fall, and felt more and more like she had not escaped something, but found it. One evening, a storm rolled low across the plain. Not fierce, just enough to push the air heavy and sharp. They brought in the wash, secured the barn doors, then sat by the window with warm mugs in hand. Rain tapped against the glass like a memory trying to get in. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move. When thunder rolled, she didn't flinch. Outside, the sky split in quiet flashes, soft and blue, painting the house in glimpses. She whispered then, the first time she had spoken anything true in days. "This feels like home." He didn't reply, but his hand found hers. No squeeze, no pull, just presence. And she understood that was his way of saying yes. Later, when the rain stopped and the roof dripped steady and slow, they stood together beneath the awning and watched the stars peek out behind the clouds. She rested her hand against his chest, felt the calm beneath. There was no story she could tell that would explain who she had been. And there was no question in him that tried to make her explain. That was the gift. He didn't want to fix her, just hold space while she repaired herself. And that night, beneath the cotton blanket he'd shared without words, she closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time in her life, that she was no longer running. She was home. She was safe. And she was wanted. Not for what she promised, but simply because she stayed. September rolled in with quiet wind and low skies. The leaves turned slow at first, Dusty golds, tired greens, a touch of copper along the edges. The air no longer pressed down on them. It lifted, crisp and dry, carrying the smell of wood and smoke, and the turning of something unseen. She took longer walks now, past the barn, down the ridge, to the low stream bed that still held water from spring. It ran soft over the stones, barely enough to ripple. She sat there sometimes with her hands in her lap, listening. He never asked where she went, but one day she returned to find a worn shawl folded on the porch rail. Not new, not washed, but placed there with care. She wore it the next morning and didn't mention it. The rhythm of their life changed with the season. The mornings came later. The hens grew quieter. The garden faded into seed and vine. They harvested what remained and stored it in jars and cloth sacks. The shelves now lined with proof that they had lived this year well. One evening she lit the lantern before he returned from the field, set the table, poured water, arranged the plates. She did it with calm hands and no urgency. When he stepped through the door, he paused, not because he was surprised, but because he recognized the feeling in the room. Something had settled. After dinner, he reached for her hand across the table. Just once. She took it and didn't let go. They slept closer now, not always touching, but near. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer emptiness. It was presence. One morning he spoke first, said, "I never thought I'd share this house again." She looked at him, waiting. He added, "Didn't think I'd want to." Then sipped his coffee and stood to fetch his boots. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the way she refilled his cup, in the way she watched him step outside, in the way she stayed. Later that day, she cleaned the shelves near the hearth, found old tools, a folded piece of cloth, a single silver button tucked beneath a book. Signs of someone who had once left but never fully gone. She didn't ask about them, just dusted each item and placed them back with quiet care. That evening, he handed her a book. It was worn, pages marked with years, a collection of folk stories. Some she recognized from childhood, others new. He said, "I thought you might like it." It was the first time he had given her something with words. She read by candlelight. He listened while sharpening a blade, the scrape of metal soft against the stone. When she reached a line that made her pause, he looked up. She read it aloud. It was about two wanderers who found a home not in walls, but in the stillness between them. He nodded once. That was all. In the days that followed, they fell into something quieter than routine. Trust. She took to wearing his coat when the air grew sharp. It hung long on her, but she liked the weight of it. He never asked for it back. She mended the torn sleeve with blue thread and left the needle in the cuff for him to notice. He did. He wore it anyway. And when the sky darkened early one afternoon and the wind carried a chill that warned of frost, he returned from the barn and said simply, "We'll need to bring in the last of the wood." She rose without needing to be told, and side by side they gathered what remained, stacked it under the porch, sealed the gaps in the windows, swept the last of the summer dust from the corners of the room. That night she lit the fire. He handed her a blanket, and in the hush of the room, beneath the creak of the wind and the pop of the stove, she knew they were ready, not for what would come, but for each other. The first frost came without warning. She woke to a thin crust of white on the windowsill, the garden silvered and stiff. The hens were quiet. The sky hung low and pale. Beside her he still slept, breath slow, one hand resting near hers beneath the blanket. She rose and pulled on his coat. Outside, her boots crunched against the brittle grass. She gathered what remained of the tomatoes, now soft and bruised, and tossed the spoiled ones to the side. The rest she carried in cold hands back to the kitchen. He joined her soon after, built the fire without words. They moved in tandem, the routine now part of their bodies, like breath, like heartbeat. Nothing needed saying. Later, while sorting old corn husks for the stove, she found an envelope tucked between pages of a forgotten almanac. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. It was a marriage certificate, not theirs, his. The name was hers, not her name, but one she might have worn in another life, in another time. He saw her holding it, didn't speak, only nodded once. She folded it slowly, set it down. "I'm not her," she said. I know, he replied. They never spoke of it again. That evening, she sat with her feet near the stove, knitting by low light. He carved something again, wood curling from his hands like quiet smoke. When he stood, he offered it to her. A bird, simple, unpainted, its wings tucked close, its beak turned slightly up. She took it and held it close. Winter pressed at the windows now. The cold came faster, darker, hungrier. They prepared in silence, moved firewood, patched holes, took turns tending the flames through the night. One morning the stream froze. She walked there anyway, stood over the ice and watched the sky stretch wide and aching above her. She didn't cry, but her breath came hard. He met her on the path back, offered a scarf, held it out without a word. She took it, wrapped it twice. They walked home side by side, footsteps in rhythm, breath ghosting in the same air. He opened the door first, but waited for her to enter. Together they stepped inside. That night she placed the carved bird on the windowsill, watched its shadow move as the fire flickered behind her. She thought of all the things she could say, about the cold, the fear, the way her body had once braced against every kindness, like it might be a trick. But she said none of it. Instead, she turned to him and rested her head against his chest. He pulled her closer, and they stood like that for a long time. They spoke less now, but felt more. The house had changed them both, not with noise, not with effort, but with patience, with space, with time. He read aloud sometimes in the evening, when the wind howled against the corners of the roof. She listened with her hands busy, sewing, slicing, stirring. His voice was slow, steady, unhurried, not for performance, just for presence. One night, he stopped reading midway through a page and looked at her. "You never told me what your name was." She smiled. "I don't think I need to," she said. He nodded. "You're right." And they left it there. The fire cracked low. The house exhaled. Snow came before the month turned. She woke to white silence, the world covered and muted. She lit the stove before he stirred. When he entered the room, his face was soft with sleep, but his eyes found hers first and stayed there. He kissed her then, once, not rushed, not rehearsed, just certain. And the quiet that followed held more than any vow. It held a life. It held her, and she let it. That night the snow kept falling, but inside nothing felt cold. She fell asleep with the carved bird in her hands and peace in her chest. Winter settled over the prairie like a thick quilt, soft, unmoving, complete. The world turned quiet beneath the weight of snow, and for once the silence did not feel empty. It felt earned. She swept the floors slower now, cooked more, read aloud in the evenings, her voice filling the corners of the house where Win once lived. He listened with his hands folded on his lap, the carved bird always resting on the mantel beside him. They stopped waiting for the next season, stopped thinking about what came after. Each morning began the same: fire, bread, coffee, his boots at the door, her shawl on the peg, their breath rising together in the kitchen's first light. Sometimes she wrote in the margins of old books. Nothing long, just thoughts, a sentence or two, words she didn't want to lose. Once he found one. "I think I'm learning how to be soft without breaking." He didn't mention it, but that night he placed a new book beside her plate at dinner. Blank pages, a quiet invitation. She began writing more after that. Not stories, not letters, just memory. The kind that only mattered because someone might read it someday and see her fully. One evening they sat near the fire as snow pressed hard against the windows. She asked, "Do you think we're married?" He looked up, smiled with only one side of his mouth. "I think we're something stronger." She didn't argue, didn't need to. In the months before spring, they built a new chicken coop together. She held the nails. He hammered. She laughed when he hit his thumb. He didn't curse, just looked at her like the sound of her laughter was worth it. They never used the front door anymore. Only the kitchen door. It was closer to the heart of things. She planted seeds on the windowsill. Basil, thyme, a little green for the months ahead. When the sun touched them in the afternoon, she leaned into the warmth and let it touch her too. The past came back sometimes, in dreams, in the sudden sound of boots on snow outside the window that turned out to be wind. But it no longer followed her. It stood still, where she had left it, and she did not go back to fetch it. The days passed without needing to be marked. No calendar, no tally, just the rhythm of warmth and labor, of stories read aloud, of shared silence. She kept writing. Sometimes he read her words when she left the pages open. Sometimes he didn't, but she always saw him glance. She made curtains from old cloth, patched with thread from a tin box she'd found in the barn. When she hung them, he stepped back and said, "Looks like they were always here." She nodded, but inside her chest tightened, because for the first time, she believed it. Snow melted slower this year. Ice lingered on the eaves, but the light shifted earlier. The birds called louder, and the wind began to carry scent again. One morning she stood outside without her coat. The air bit, but not cruelly. She let it. He joined her, carrying two mugs, one in each hand. She took hers, fingers brushing his. Their breath drifted in soft curls as they looked over the quiet land. "We could paint the barn," she said. He raised a brow. "It's ugly," she added. He smiled wide this time. "Then I suppose we'll need red paint." It wasn't a plan. It was a promise. They spent that afternoon walking the edge of the field. Not searching, not guarding, just walking. She picked up stones, pocketed one without knowing why. That night she placed it on the windowsill beside the bird. A marker. Of time. Of place. Of having chosen to stay. And when she looked at him across the quiet room, lamp glowing between them, she knew. Whatever name the world had for what they were, didn't matter. They belonged. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of being known. The barn turned red in spring. They painted it slowly, over many days, brush by brush, coat by coat. The wind carried the scent across the field, mixed with the fresh bloom of grass and the sweetness of thawed soil. It stood bright against the landscape, a marker of something rebuilt, something chosen. She stepped back often to admire it. Not the color, but the act. He never said why he agreed to it. Not the color, but the act. He never said why he agreed to it. But each evening, he cleaned the brushes carefully, hung them to dry, and stood beside her as the sun dropped behind their work. The hens laid more now. The garden began to lift its head again. Rose turned green, soil turned warm. She moved through it barefoot some mornings, sleeves rolled high, her dress pulled up in one hand to keep it from the mud. He watched her from the porch, arms crossed, soft smile tucked beneath his beard. They had no calendar, but they knew the days by the way the land spoke. One morning he handed her a letter.